Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this lesson, we're going to be looking at creating not only strong characters, but strong themes. Now you might be wondering why we put those two things together. Well, to start with, what we're looking at when we're creating strong characters is basically they're going to be representing your main ideas in your story. And essentially the stories you're going to be writing are going to be pretty much that short that your characters are going to dominate them. And so to have characters with basically your strongest feature means that you are writing stories with very strong themes, and they automatically represent those themes. So what you're looking for here is basically creating these very strong, very interesting, and very detailed sorts of characters that are best able to represent your ideas and your themes together, and essentially allows you to get meaning in a much stronger sense. So now, the reason why characters are important is, as I said before, the length of your story is short. So, it must be character driven, and for that reason, the premise of your story will focus on your characters. So if you've got a story about main idea or theme of change, it's very hard to represent it without characters. And those characters must be representative of some change. And if you want to represent it deeply, those characters must be strong characters. If you've got a father and son and they change because they drift apart, and that's it, not only is it not very exciting, it's not very deep either. You're not going to get a very strong mark for that. If you go into and you add different qualities to them, dad's a fisherman off at sea, calls his son on the radio every day, have a bit of a profile for them, have a bit of a background to them, then it starts to create a little bit more deeply, and certainly that idea of change or whatever it may be really does come across a lot more strongly. And as I said, strong characters are better able to represent strong themes. So this is what you should be looking for. Okay, so let's look at characterization, because this is going to be the big key component to how you're developing not only your strong characters but your strong themes. And this is basically where your themes are going to come out, is by doing extra work here. Now, creating characters is, as I said, not just as simple as creating any old sort of cliche character and just working with them. You need to really go deeply into them. So think about the details you can actually reveal about a character before you do anything else. This is probably the most important thing you can do. So first of all, their physicality, how they move. Now these are no particular order, but we'll start with physicality, because the way that someone moves, now it might be a very small detail, and certainly if you think about if one person is right-handed or one person's left-handed, they might be small things, but they do sort of display certain characteristics. And certainly if you want to show someone's old or young without having to say, oh, you're 78 years old, then just by describing how they move can allow you to do that in such a way where you don't even have to go much into ages or points of view like that. So physicality can be an interesting point, and certainly if you explore it, you can learn a lot about a character very quickly. The mentality, how they think. Okay, so how they go about doing things, how they go about solving problems is it's a key consideration that you think about. If you think about a simple maths problem, for instance, you go 5 plus 6 equals 11, there are a number of different ways that people get to that solution. It's not just, just do it in a book and we'll get the answer. Even doing that, there are a number of different mental ways of doing it. So just to say how they think is not something that is the same with each person. Obviously everyone's different, so how they think is a really key consideration. Their quirks. Now, it's very important here that you don't have too many of them, because if you've got someone that's too quirky, they're very, very hard to relate to. But if you've got one or two quirks, one or two small sort of features about them which make them interesting, then those are some things that come across quite well. And certainly if you represent someone's quirks in an interesting or a unique sort of way, you're able to really create them as an identifiable character. So it's something to look at, and certainly don't make them too quirky, don't make them too odd and weird and strange, but have a little bit of weirdness about them. They don't have to be just plain old boring characters. Their lifestyle. Okay, so how they live can tell a lot about them. If you say, like, one has a clean house, one has a dirty house, for instance, it tells a lot about them. And there's a lot that you can interpret based on that. If someone has a messy house, they could be lazy, they could be disorganized. It represents a lot of things about them. If you say that someone's very clean, it means they're very organized, it means that they're very sort of upright, upstanding. they care a lot, attention to detail, obsessive compulsive, all these things can be thrown into that mix of what that person could be. Physical, what they look like. Okay, so even when you're describing this, try and think about using other avenues of just describing rather than just say, oh, he had red hair and blue eyes, but actually try and give them a quality, a characteristic, something about the way that they look which is distinctive and basically sets them apart from other people. Even if it means using a metaphor or some other way of looking at them, then use that. I mean, that will give you a little bit more depth and certainly makes them stand out a bit. You don't want characters that look the same. Even when you're writing, if you're describing two characters in exactly the same way, your reader's going to get confused. So something that makes them stand out. Aspirations, basically what they want. People want different things. Even people who seem to have everything want something else. So what do they want to do? Relationships. Are they married, not married? Friendships, cohorts, etc. Everyone. And finally, the personality, how they act around other people. How they do things, basically how they are in social situations. So if you make all these if you think about these characteristics and make all these characterizations, one of the things you're doing is you're not just reflecting sort of different characters, you're reflecting different people. And if you're reflecting different people, then you're really getting at the heart of what the ideas are. And certainly if you're trying to represent a theme, if you do it with people who seem like genuine, living, breathing characters, then it's going to come across a lot stronger than if you were to do it otherwise. Okay, so let's move on. Now, strong characterization basically requires you to take each concept that you basically have taken from those 8 points and to really go into depth with them. Alright, now what I mean by going into depth with them is essentially thinking about them for a bit more than 2 seconds. So when you are essentially thinking about each thing, how they look, you don't just say, oh, he's got brown hair, blue eyes, done. Easy. No. Think about doing it in a little bit of a different way. Think about brown hair, blue eyes. Okay, that sort of makes them like a bear. And then you start to describe all these other bear-like qualities about them. Even though I know most bears don't have blue eyes, they have black eyes, but still, you can make that assumption. You can build those sorts of things. I mean, use a blank slate, but start to colour them in a little bit. I mean, you're not trying to create a person, you're trying to bring them to life. So really think about some details and some characteristics. They'll really make them seem like they're someone that everyone knows. Now, that might be something that seems like it's a fairly simple point, and so you're going, okay, well, what's this got to do with English anymore if you're trying to bring people to life now? I mean, I'm not saying that you're bringing people back from the dead. What I'm saying is that you're representing in a way that you, by making them real people, you're essentially allowing your reader to really identify with them, and certainly it means that you're able to project themes quite deeply as opposed to really shallowly, and you can't really imagine it at all. So by having those depth of characters, you're really helping. And they need to have complexity and subtlety at the same time. Now, what I mean by this is by having complexity, it means they have things which make them different and interesting as a person. Certainly, everyone is complex in their own way, that they're not simple, that they're not just a simple cut-out cartoon character. And subtlety means that they have small little things that only really close friends would notice. And those sorts of things really show an intimate knowledge of your characters and certainly shows an understanding of what sorts of things people notice, and even small things people notice in certain situations. And certainly if you look at things of great change, often the thing people will tell you are the small details, not the big ones. So this is where subtlety comes in. And basically, as I said before, complexity means that they do have the depth that you need, and subtlety gives them a bit of life. So complexity means that if you're going to a theme of change, it means that you can explore it in a complex sort of way. That it's not just change because they're a father and son, but it's a change because they've that complexity means they've had a complex relationship, or there's been different things that have happened at different times, which means that the change between them is quite more significant than if they're just two ordinary fathers and sons. And subtlety gives them life. It helps to set them apart from other people and other father and son characters. So having those two things together, as I said, really do bring them to life. And they can develop a connection. As I said, one of your roles, and particularly to add depth, you need to develop connection with your reader. So it's a really important thing to do. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to do a very quick characterization exercise where basically we're going to put some complex details down and some subtle ones. So to start with, let's look at some complex details that you can give a character. They have complicated routines to the point that they require a 5 a.m. start. Now this is a very big quirk in that when you imagine someone getting ready in the morning, you sort of imagine something maybe takes half an hour to an hour. If you have this really complicated routine that requires a 5 a.m. start, there's something obviously a little bit odd about them. Absolute perfectionists, okay, that might have something to do with the complicated 5 a.m. starts. But it starts to put those two pieces together and certainly builds that characterization of them. Habits means few lasting relationships, obviously, or friendships. And if you imagine it, you start to picture this person now, someone who has so many really complicated things and so obsessive compulsive that they can't really make friends because all the things that they do when they're being obsessive compulsive really annoy other people. And constant regret that past imperfection ruin dreams or ruin their dreams. And again, that can basically sort of stem to the reason why they're being so obsessive compulsive is because at one moment they weren't in their life previously has cost them something very dear. So that's something, and it means that they have a lot of complexity now, and anything that happens to them will not only be, and not only is it will be related to those sorts of characteristics if you do it well enough, but you're able to do it in a way that basically explores that person. And certainly we start to say, well, I might not know someone like that, but I do have something like that, that these sorts of habits that, oh, this guy's a smoker and he doesn't make many friendships because people hate it when he smokes. And that's the sort of detail that connects with people. Now, subtle details, constantly scratches the left arm to the point it bleeds. Okay, it's a small detail, but it's something that sort of represents maybe someone a bit anxious. Curious lisp for PH sounds, so they say it a bit differently, anything like phonics or anything else like that. They have a strange way of saying it. I'm not going to try and attempt a strange sort of lisp now because you'll probably make fun of me, so we won't do that. Smell of lotion on him, probably from the arm. So again, we start to get that image of this character, and already these sorts of things start to really form a picture in someone's head. And constantly stretching, has a sore back as well. Again, this has nothing to do with the rest of it, but we start to sort of see this person who's in pain, who's in almost a bit, someone you feel a bit sorry for. So immediately we have this complexion and almost something we can describe without even going into too much detail. We haven't even gone to any physical characteristics, and yet already we probably have this image in our head of someone. And someone who's quite distinct, someone who we would remember. Certainly if you're reading a story out of 100 odd exam responses, you would remember a story like this and remember this sort of character because they're quite strong and they obviously have a little bit of depth to them. And not only that, they'd also have